Feel free to pop in the chat box where you're from, and we'll get started in just a moment. I'm going to kick things off now, just so we're not keeping anybody unnecessarily. So welcome once again to our webinar. We're going to be looking today at a postgraduate's guide to doing a literature review. And I'm going to introduce our panel in just a moment. But before I do that, I just wanted to run through a couple of quick notes. So once you're in the Zoom meeting, just make sure you're connected to the audio. You should be able to see and hear all of your panel today. We won't be able to see or hear any of our attendees today, I'm afraid. If you'd like to interact with our panel, you can use the chat box, and you can also post questions in the Q&A box. The reason for that is really just because of the large number of people that we're expecting. So as I say, chat box for any quick comments. If you'd like to put a question to the panel, we will have some time at the end of the session today for Q&A with our three panelists. There should also be a function for you to actually click upvote on the question. So if you see somebody else has put a really good question in the chat box and you think that's a great question, I'd like to know the answer to that too. If you could put a tick next to that, and that should float it up to the top of the box for us. Just to know, if you've got anything open on your computer right now that's using a lot of connectivity, you might just want to close it down to get the best experience. The session, as you probably would have seen a note pop up, is being recorded today, just in case anybody wants to watch it back, and also for all those people that were unable to attend, and we will be sharing this on our social media afterwards too. Do feel free to share yourself with your colleagues and with your students. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel. So we have three speakers today and a chair. So Dr. Helen Aviard is Principal Lecturer at Oxford Brookes University. She is one of the lead authors on the book that this webinar is based around, and they'll be talking in some detail about what the book can do for you. She's also published a number of best-selling books for this, for undergraduates and postgraduates doing research within the health and social care field. You can see those there, and we're delighted that Helen is joining us today. Professor Sheila Payne is also one of our panelists. She is based at Lancaster University. She's supervised over 35 students and been an external examiner for more than 60 PhDs. So she's extremely well qualified to give advice in this field. And we're delighted she's also been an author on a number of our best-selling books. Professor Nancy Preston is also an author on this title, and she's also written in the field of palliative care nursing for us. She's an experienced PhD supervisor, and I'm sure we'll have some great tips to share with you today. So welcome to our panel, Nancy. And I'm also delighted to say that we have a recently graduated PhD student, Maddie French, who has offered to be our chair today. So she's going to be putting some questions to our panel, and also putting your questions as attendees to the panelists later in the session. I think she will probably have a few minutes to introduce herself, but she's just finished a PhD in health research at Lancaster University, and also has a master's in public health from the University of York. So plenty of research experience, which I think will be extremely helpful in guiding the conversation today. So welcome to all of you, and thank you once again for giving your time and expertise today for us. I'm just going to stop sharing my slides, and I will pass over to Maddie to introduce herself and to get ahead with the interview today. Thank you so much.
All right, lovely. Thank you, Bryony. Yes, as Bryony said, I'm Maddie French. I've just very recently been awarded my PhD in health research at Lancaster University. And so, yeah, my experience of starting and doing a postgraduate literature review is still very fresh in my memory, all the joys and the challenges of that. So really excited to be part of this webinar today, and to ask some questions to the authors, and see what questions people come up with as well. So if you want to ask, obviously think questions might come to you as we go along really, so feel free to pop them into the Q&A as we have our discussion, and then at the end I'll go through those and pick some out that seem to be quite popular and put them to the authors as well. All right, lovely. So please get started, I guess. So just to introduce the book a bit, Helen, do you want to tell us a little bit about it and why you decided to write it?
Okay, thanks very much, Maddie. So yes, Postgraduate's Guide to Doing a Literature Review in Health and Social Care was written in order to provide a deeper, more advanced guide to doing a lit review than which was provided in my undergraduate textbook. So the undergraduate textbook, similar name, is directed at third-year students doing their dissertation. And whilst the basic principles are there for postgraduates, and we were finding that a lot of postgraduates were using it, the depth that was needed at postgraduate level wasn't really in that text. It was a starter. It didn't go to postgraduate level specifically. So in view of student feedback, we decided that it would be good to write an in-depth guide for postgraduate students, acknowledging that in nursing, as in other disciplines, doing a rigor in doing a lit review is becoming ever more and more important. We like to think we're ahead of the game in that. And it's also important to appreciate that there is lots of guidance on doing a systematic review, but a lot of this is really detailed and aimed at people doing, for example, really big detailed reviews such as Cochrane collaboration reviews. And even at postgraduate level, we felt students needed a more accessible text. And that was why we wrote this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I definitely, I remember searching for information when I was starting to do mine, and it's either very, very complex or very, very detailed. And when you're just starting off, you really just need that introduction, don't you, to, what is it that I'm trying to do, which I think this book really, really offers. I think so. I think one of the early chapters looks at, it's dedicated to the research questions. You have a whole chapter about sort of designing the research question, I think. And I know that was one of the things I was struggled with a little bit when I did my PhD, in that at the beginning I sort of came up with my PhD research question, and then I started my lit review, and I thought, really, what kind of question is that answering compared to my PhD question? Because in my head I thought it was the same one, but actually, well, I had lots of conversations with Nancy, who was my supervisor, so she might remember some of this. And so we're trying to work out how the research, the review question compared to the research question of your PhD or your master's, I think is really important. Nancy, do you want to talk a bit about that, about why is it really important getting that question right for the review?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial. And I think, it might be that you're doing your review as part of a master's program and it's a standalone review, or it might be as a precursor, as a, part of your PhD. And but getting the review question takes a while, and I'd say it's a real skill. And you might have an idea, I suppose, like Maddie said, it might be if you're doing a PhD, you've got a review question which is the same, you think, as your research question. But actually, when you go and look, you found somebody, there's no literature to review. So therefore, how can you review literature that doesn't exist to come up with a question? So you're kind of looking to see what is there out there that you can make the review question pertinent to your PhD. Equally, you might go there and you ask a question, there's way too much literature, and you think, well, I need to narrow that down, and you need to think about how do I narrow that down, and there's real sort of inclusion exclusion criteria you need to develop for your review question. We teach a 10-week module on systematic review skills for postgraduate students, and I would say it's a really iterative process developing your review question. And we always have a half an hour one-to-one with students right at the beginning to help them really think, what is my review question? And that will still change as they start going through the literature, they see what's available. Then you might modify your question, you might change things. As you start your searching improves, it might change it. So I think there's some real key elements to get your review question right. And if you get it right, it can really inform particularly if you're doing a PhD study, really can set the scene for you to help you understand how to then develop your research on the basis of that. That's one of your really foundation blocks for your PhD. But there's loads of issues about developing your research question. And, that's why I say it's not straightforward. I think you've got to really keep, going back to it and questioning it. And I mean, maybe an example might be a student of mine who was wanting to look at the impact on relationships of couples where somebody had advanced Parkinson's disease. And for a start, that's really hard to search, because how do you search for quality of relationships? That's really quite difficult. And again, inclusion criteria can help you with that. Definitions can help. So you have a working definition of what you're looking for. But also she had to really think, well, what do I search? Because there weren't any papers on her subject at all. And she thought, well, what's the next nearest literature? And that then changed her review question. So instead of advanced Parkinson's, it was Parkinson's disease. So hopefully that touches on some of the elements of it, but I think might be something we come back to because it is really quite complicated.
Yeah, actually, another question on sort of a review question really is, it made me think in my confirmation, so it's the 12-month point through your PhD. I think one of the questions I got was, have you answered your review question? And so is it really important to be able to answer that, be able to actually give an answer to the question that you posed?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I guess that we sometimes talk about empty review. So if you're doing a Cochrane review, I mean, Cochrane have moved away from empty reviews, not very keen on them, where you complete a whole rigorous review and you say at the end of it, there wasn't any evidence, therefore we cannot draw a conclusion. I mean, it's helpful to tell you there's a big gap in the research literature, but it's not, it's an answer. You've answered it. But I think, you're in a way, I suppose, particularly for a PhD, you want your review question to answer itself so far, but identify the gaps and identify what we still don't know and what we need to know. So, hopefully that, you will come to an answer, but the answer might be, well, we still don't quite know enough, or we know we can answer an element of it, but we still need to know more about X, Y, and Z. But for a master's project, again, you still might not come up with a definitive answer, but you might do more because you've got more opportunity to complete and finish something. You're not looking to move it straight into a new area.
Yeah. So we've talked a bit about some of the searches, that aspect of doing a review. And in the book, there's a lot of emphasis on taking a systematic approach. So Helen, do you want to talk a bit about what does it really mean to take a systematic approach to your searches and a little bit?
Yeah, thank you, Maddie. I think going back to what Nancy was saying just before, I think the first really important thing, and this might sound really obvious, but it kind of needs saying, is to really understand what you're doing. What are you searching for? And if conceptually you're not clear, it'll be very, very hard to search for. So like Nancy was saying, well, some topics are really hard to define, and what are you? So I think you've got to be really sure conceptually what you're searching for. So that's the first sort of hard work that needs to be done in order to get you started. And then we come to the databases. And the longer that I've been teaching this and doing this and writing about this, I've realized that it's really quite complex, is searching the database. It's far more complex than we might like to think. And this is always reinforced to me that we teach students, I teach our professional doctorate students this, and they look at us thinking, do you really need to tell us this? And then when they go away and do it, they discover how complex. So the more I work with this, the more I realize the complexities of it. So I guess the first thing is not to skimp on understanding how the databases work. And we all know that they work on this basis of keywords and Boolean operators, etc. But it's really understanding what your keywords are going to be, how you're going to combine them, how you're going to get to those keywords that are going to illuminate your topic and are going to get you to the papers that you want. It's really useful to plan a search out in advance so that you can see by looking at it, is that going to take me where I want it to take me? And it's really important to keep a note of what you search for as well. Otherwise, you'll think, well, surely I looked at that. And then you go back to your search and realize, well, no, actually, I didn't look at that. So having a really planned search. But I think to emphasize, the key is having that conceptual understanding of what you're searching for before you go to the databases.
And do you think that librarians can be quite useful helping with that? I know that at Lancaster there's a specialist who's really good at helping you think through some of those things.
Yes, absolutely, because it's there, they're doing it all the time, and they're really, really skilled. And even if they don't know the topic, they still are able to come up with a really workable plan of how to search. So absolutely, they're really, really useful.
And then once you've got your studies, then it kind of turns into what do you do with them? And the first step is about, as you talk about in your book, is about appraising, so critical appraisal. So Sheila, I haven't come to you yet. Do you want to have a chat about some of the different approaches to appraising the literature and how you might advise students going about that?
Thanks, Maddie, and big congratulations for your own PhD. That was terrific. Well done. So having done your review, done your searching in the way that Helen has described, you have a mass of papers mostly, and what you don't really know is, are all the papers of the same quality? And they may not be. So you might have some really good studies that have been done very, very rigorously, and some studies that are not so rigorously done for one reason or another. So that's what critical appraisal is. It's helping you to make sense of what is the quality of the studies that you've selected. Now, there are different approaches to this, a bit depending on whether you are going to make a criteria that you're only going to look at systematic reviews or very quantitative type papers, whether you're going to have qualitative papers included, or whether you're going to have a bit of both and you're having mixed method studies. And while there are some very good guidelines on how to do critical appraisal for quite quantitative research, like systematic reviews, and that is extremely helpful and well documented, it's perhaps a little bit more difficult to judge the quality of some of the other methods. And why should we do this? Because if you lumped all papers in together, whether they're good quality and bad quality, it may really change the answer that you get to your review question in the way that Nancy suggested. And if you take a very large selection of studies, they may be weighted more towards the poorer or less rigorous quality studies, particularly if studies have been done over a long time where our methods have developed. So there are specific review, critical review tools, and they need to be congruent with the kinds of methods that you're going to be including in your study. Now, I'm going to give you an example. So a long time ago, I and my researchers, Sheila Hawker and Christine Kerr, we were working on a review about older people. And at that time, it was quite in the early days where review methodologies was still very much in development. And while there was really good guidance on critical appraisal for quantitative studies, at the time, there was not good guidance on how to combine quantitative and qualitative studies. And so we developed a tool which allowed you to take on board very different disparate data sources, and that's a tool that's published, it's available to use, and allows you to score each in various sections, each of the papers that you've included in your review. Now, the other thing to remember, most people do some sort of critical appraisal, and then they just go ahead and write it up and kind of forget that they've somehow done a critical appraisal. So if you do one, please include it. So include either the scores or set yourself a criterion that you're going to discard papers below a certain criteria, below a certain score level, which indicates poorer quality. Or if you don't, justify why you don't. So please use the critical appraisal tool that's appropriate to your methods. And secondly, include it when you get on to the next stage, which is synthesizing all of your results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really great advice. I know, I think I used that tool that you mentioned actually, and when I did my PhD review, because I did a mixed methods one, and it was very useful. I found, and I don't know what your views are on this actually, Sheila, so I ended up having to add another criteria specific to something that I was interested in, which was about, so I was looking at socioeconomic related subtopics, and I really wanted to know, is socioeconomic issues the main focus of the studies that I'm looking at? Because I think that was really interesting. So do you think it's okay to add little things to your quality appraisal tool that sort of suit your purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. It should be tailored to the question that you're answering. And using existing tools is helpful because you don't have to do the hard work of developing it all from scratch. But by all means, go ahead and add things. My suggestion is that you don't take things out of existing tools unless you've got a really good reason to do that. because that's the sort of thing that makes the tool less valid. And it's the sort of thing that reviewers might question when you come to publish your work.
And so, Nancy, when you've done your critical appraisal, you've got your scores, and then you've got your studies that you include in front of you, you then have to extract the data that you're going to try to synthesize. So do you have any tips on or guidance about how you approach that, and maybe what the pitfalls are in that?
Yeah, I always think one of the key things is keep your review question in mind. I often say to students, stick it to the top of your laptop or your screen, so that it's, and that's true even when you're doing if you're doing a PhD and you're doing you know, primary data collection, put your research question at the top of your screen. Never forget it. It's very easy to, and it's very easy to go off and start finding all these terribly interesting things, but they don't actually answer your review question. And I think you need to think there are different types of data, and it's not necessarily, you know, where is the data in that paper? And in I suppose, a more traditional Cochrane type review, say you're on interventions and you're looking what are outcomes from different interventions. One of the things I'd be careful to worry about, not worry about, is their main outcome tool might not be the same as yours, but they would have used your outcome as a secondary data outcome tool. So an example of this was a review I was involved in, looking at something called pleural effusions, where you get fluid around the lung. And our outcome we were looking at had the effusion still gone after 4 weeks of treatment. Now that was sometimes maybe a secondary measure, or you know, another measure. They might have been measuring something else. What was the results on the X-ray? But we still took the measure we were looking for. That was the key measure for us. I mean, and often you're converting it into your timescale or work. For qualitative research, that can be even more complicated, because you know, it might be that the review method of synthesis is asking you to really look for, say, quotes, in which case that is the data that you're pulling from. And so a lot of the data is likely to be in the results section. But other times it might still have, you know, sort of found its way into the discussion. So you don't think we're all very, you know, I'm an author, I'm not always the best at where you know, we try not to put new data always in the discussion, but some qualitative research you'd quite have a merge between your research, your results and your discussion anyway. So you'd need to really check and look through. And I think the other point is that sometimes there isn't a lot said about the subject you're in, and you're trying to find what evidence you can. So I had a student, she was looking at recruitment to clinical trials in palliative care, and there's very, very little sort of primary research, and it was largely opinion based. And so she was trying to synthesize experience of people from doing this kind of work. She'd flagged what the problems were, and that was really quite commonly in the discussion. So I'd say really have a look around. Don't rely on the abstract and the conclusions. That's often where us authors are selling our work. You know, really get in the paper. You know, like Helen said, there's no sort of shortcut with that. You've got to read it and find where the data might be.
Yeah, and I think the thing you said about sometimes with qualitative research, what you need is in the discussion. It really made me think of my master's review, actually, because that was palliative care in prisons, and so it spanned different disciplines. And I noticed actually in sort of more sociology or criminology, all the information was in the discussion, really, all the extra sort of results, and then everything else in the other disciplines was somewhere else. So you have to get a feel to what you're looking for and where you're going to find it, don't you?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, to think that different disciplines have different practices and different countries have different practices. And it just reminded me of something, I suppose, in terms of searching. Be really aware of terms maybe used in the UK are used differently in the US. I remember I was looking for comfort measures, which meant how do you comfort people, make people feel more comfortable. And it turned out comfort measures was kind of a term for end of life care in the US. You know, and it's like really be careful about understanding different publishing techniques, different disciplines, different countries, and we all approach research slightly differently.
Thank you. One of the challenges I had with my PhD thesis when I came to do the review, I think, was, so I did a mixed methods one, and then when you come to synthesize the findings, there's always a bit of a challenge about how you do that. And I found some of the advice you might seek from textbooks or you know, articles or whatever it's not always very clear, or sometimes it's sort of you're not really sure what to do. So Helen, do you want to talk a bit about what you talk about in the book regarding synthesizing data and how you approach it?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Maddie. Yeah, so obviously a huge question. We'll try and answer as succinctly as we can. And I'll just draw as well on Sheila's point about critical appraisal, because this is where this comes in. And also Nancy's point about remember what your research question is, because those are both absolutely critical here. With critical appraisal, I think we're so used to doing it and teaching it, but applying it in a lit review is a different matter, and yet we've got to try and include the critical appraisal when we're doing our analysis. So there's two, very, very broadly speaking, there's probably two types of analysis. There's a quantitative, the very traditional sort of meta-analysis, which people are doing if they're doing a review of effectiveness, your traditional sort of Cochrane reviews, which probably doesn't relate to most of our listeners here today. The alternative is a more of a narrative thematic analysis, which has its roots in the qualitative methods of data analysis. And there are different types. There's very well-known one is the thematic analysis, Braun and Clark, which is very much used. The grounded theory approach of constant comparative analysis is another very well-used approach. And while there are similarities with these methods, the main limitation, which has had quite a lot of discussion recently in the sort of research methods discussion, is that the temptation is to make this too simplistic and try, and criticism is that researchers and student researchers end up with sort of a list of what they feel is coming out of the papers, and that list is stripped of all context. And so I suppose the key is to keep that context and to keep that rich discussion so that you draw out of the papers with the essence of what they're saying about the research question in detail, and not losing that depth in order to just produce a sort of list of findings. We can context strip those findings of what those papers are telling us. So the message is that synthesis has got to keep that richness of the data within it. And that's the challenge, I think, when you're doing that level of synthesis. Mm-hmm. It's something that discussion with others, with your research team, with your supervisors, with anyone really who will listen to you will really help you to sort of join some of the dots and maybe, you know, avoid that temptation just to reduce it to a list of, you know, we found this, this and this, and taking the contexts away. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the challenge we've got to try and encourage researchers to do.
And you say, does it feel like there's more information out now than perhaps it would have been sort of 7 years ago about how to approach these kind of things? Is it sort of an area where if people look at the more recent publications and the methods of this might be quite useful?
Yes, I think so. Although, of course, in recent years, there has been more discussion about this tendency to reduce the qualitative analysis of papers to a much more of a sort of list-based approach. So I suppose it's trying to find good examples in the literature and using those as good examples.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. And then well, hopefully some PhD students might, and some master students as well, might be trying to publish their review as well. So I think you know, it's one thing to try and do a review as part of getting a qualification, but then there's another step of trying to get it published, perhaps in a peer-reviewed journal. So Sheila, do you want to talk a bit about what can students do to try and help their chances of getting published in a peer-reviewed journal?
Thank you. I really encourage you all to think about publication. It's a great way to capture all that hard work that you've put into doing your review. And I'm sure that your supervisors would support and help you in that process. So first thing is, I really encourage you to do it. So how do you go about it to make sure that you have the most chance of success? So the first thing is, think really carefully about who it is you want to communicate with. So is your review going to produce information that's going to help research methods, because then you need to communicate with researchers? Is it going to help clinicians? Then you need to think about which ones. And so think about your audience. Who needs to hear what you've done and how you've done it? The other thing I say is find your key message. So when you've done your very careful review process and you've synthesized all your information, you should be able to say in just about one sentence or so, what is the new thing that you found? Or have you found gaps in the literature? Because that's important too. So it's not only what we know, but what we don't know. Both of them are important, but it should be really brief. You should be able to encapsulate that message very, very succinctly and clearly. So the good news is that most journals are really keen to publish reviews. And the reason is because they get excited a lot. So the journal editors really like reviews because it boosts their impact factors. So that's the good news. The other thing to think about is think about the match between the journal that you want to go for and the mission or the aims of that journal, the target audience, and what you've actually done. And I always encourage people to think about a specific journal rather than just generically preparing something, because you need to go to the guidance from that journal. And you can have a top list. I often say have at least 3 journals that in order, priority number 1, number 2, and number 3, that you're going to try and get your review published in. And the other one is look really, really carefully at that author guidance. You know, if they say they'll publish something in 3,000 words, 5,000 words, or 7,000 words, do not send your whole review, which may be 10 or 15,000 words long. It does need to be cut down. And the other thing, because it's a review, you need to explain and show how rigorously you've done it. So the methods section needs to be really well presented and very, very explicit. Now, there are types of tools that help guide you through the process. And I think Helen's going to tell us more about that.
Yeah, Helen, do you want to just step in there and talk a bit about these tools?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thanks, Maddie. Thanks, Sheila. Yeah, so this is where it all gets as well a little bit more complex. In our book, we describe, and it's well known, it's well debated in the literature, how many different types of literature review there are. And I, in fact, did some work with a colleague, and we identified 35 names for systematic, what they were called systematic reviews, whether you use the term systematic or not on non-Cochrane systematic reviews is another point for discussion, which is probably takes us beyond the role of this seminar. There are lots and lots of different published types of doing a literature review. Now, when you publish, you need to obviously give your method. Ideally, your method will relate back to a recognised type of review. When we did our study and we found the 35 different types, we could probably summarise those into maybe 5 or 6 types. They just said use different words. But ideally, when you're publishing, it's good to use reporting guidelines so you can make sure that you're reporting your study as will make it clear for the reader exactly what you've done, and adhering to these guidelines is a really useful way of doing it. For literature reviews, it's not always, because we've got so many different types, there isn't always a guideline that maps to that particular type. So it's worth looking at the Equator guidelines and so on to see what maybe the nearest fit is for that literature review. But at the moment, that is still, I'm going to say, work in progress, exploring exactly which reporting guidelines are going to help people writing literature reviews in writing up for a journal. So I'm say that is work in progress. It's something that we are discussing at the RCN Research Conference in September, just to add that in as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I found reporting guidelines really useful when I submitted my master's thesis, I think, to a journal. because it feels almost like a bit of admin you do, and then you do it and you realize actually this is really about improving the messaging of your review. You feel it's sharpening the quality of what you're trying to do.
But yes, I agree. And in order to do that, they've got to match the review that you're writing, and that's a challenge at the moment, is marrying those two together.
Thank you. So I guess we've probably got time now to turn to some of the questions in the Q&A. So I'm just going to have a read through some of those and see if I can bring together a couple of those. Just for clarification points, I think there was a couple of questions about the critical appraisal tool that we referred to. And someone's asking, could you clarify what it was called or add a reference to it, perhaps?
I've added it into the chat.
Oh, have you? Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I guess just starting at the top, there's a question at the top from someone who's anonymous, where they talk about the difficulties of moving from scoping the literature to, they want to know how do you formalise that and then begin to bring that into focusing more on reviewing the literature in the systematic way we're talking about. So perhaps, Nancy, do you want to talk a bit about how you move from that scoping place to sort of formally doing a review?
Yeah, so I mean, as Helen says, the terminology in all this really doesn't help us. So there are scoping reviews, but at the same time, you can talk about scoping and looking around to see what there is. So I mean, often if there's very little on something, you might do a scoping review because you're kind of just collecting it all together. But the first thing I would say is you want to have a scope to see what's out there, then refine that review question. And then look for the papers that meet your inclusion exclusion criteria to narrow that down and see where you really are at. Is that kind of what you were meaning, Maddie?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it's sort of not sure knowing how to move from those two into.
And also where the literature review begins and the introduction ends can be a tricky decision to make, can't it? At one point you have to get focused, and that's in your lit review, but before that it's background information, and that where the one meets the other is also a point you need to decide on.
I think, actually building on that, I think there's been a few questions on inclusion and exclusion criteria, and perhaps, you know, that maybe being one of these ways that you formalise this sort of step into systematic review. So someone's asked about how you decide on the inclusion and exclusion criteria, about eliminating two things. And I think someone else spoke about the difficulty they had finding articles on an aspect that doesn't have an agreed definition. So I think they were talking, so it's Andrew who made that comment in context of doing a review on midwifery. So I guess, is there any thoughts you had about how do you go through that process of starting that, you know, perhaps your beginning point of having an inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then how do you work out if that's really capturing what you want it to capture, or if it's not capturing your these terms, what do you then do? Helen, do you want to go for that one?
Well, I was just going to say it's trial and error, but Nancy and Sheila might have a more
I think with definitions that's key, because you do need to have a working definition that works throughout your thesis. And so a student of mine who was looking at resilience in nurses, and there's a masses of definitions about resilience. So he had to decide which version he was using and applying. Sheila and I have been involved in reviews where we looked about integrative palliative care, and again there's loads of different terminologies, and actually we developed a consensus statement within the research group about what is the definition we are going to use, and you will say the strengths and limitations to any choice or judgment you make as you go through your review, and you know, and you can recognize that. So this is my definition of resilience, and you know, and one of your limitations in the paper might be maybe I could have used something different or whatever. But unless you've developed that, it's very, very hard to keep working with 20 definitions in your head. It's got to be something concrete. So I'd say it's very much a working definition that you use.
So to me, Maddie, it goes back to the very first point that we talked about, the importance of the review question. So in your review question, you should be able to operationalize, in other words, define each of the key words or terms in that question. So if you use a statement like resilience or coping or whatever, there are many different terms, as Nancy says, but it meanings for those terms, but they also, like coping, comes from different theoretical perspectives. So I think, as Nancy explained, spending time to really nail your review question. So what is the question, and what does each word in that question mean? And actually just defining that underneath in terms of key concepts is a really useful way. And that then means that you'll almost already have your criteria. Because if you're going to say use a term like coping, but you will be excluding all psychodynamic explanations, for example, that come from a particular theory, that's a criteria. So you've already started to shape your criteria in thinking about your review question.
And I guess in doing that sort of exploratory approach, if you're thinking about definitions, you're still getting quite a lot of information about the wide literature, which for a PhD, is really, really relevant, isn't it? So I guess I'm thinking some of this stuff, it might end up being in your background or in your discussion chapter, because it's part of what you're looking at, and some of the ambiguity in the subject you're interested in.
Yes, people often want to rush in to do to do searches, because they think that's what a review is, doing lots of searches. But if you don't spend some time at the beginning on your question and being really clear what the definition that you're going to be using are, then that searching can be really problematic.
And also, just to add to that, our name terms for things change as well, don't they? Not only research terms change, but terms that we use in clinical practice change all the time as well. So you might think you know what you're searching for, and then you realize actually that thing you're searching was very similar to a term that we used to use, or another concept that I'm thinking of the term shared decision making. Is that the same as getting consent or not? Is there a boundary or not? And those are decisions that you've got to make, being aware that the terms are constantly shifting. So that adds to the complexity. But you've got to somewhere put the boundaries of what you're looking at.
I just realised we didn't really say much about inclusion criteria, and there might be some more boring inclusion criteria, which might be, what year do I want to start searching from? So it might be that a phrase hasn't really been developed, or a concept or idea, until say the mid-90s, in which case you might want to start searching the early 90s or something from then on. It might be what language has the paper got to be in, because there's some quite good translational software now, but realistically you might, if English is your only language, then English might be all you can look for. So there's a whole load of inclusion criteria that you would need to write down. Is it about just adults, children? There's a whole range of things, and I think we do cover that in the book and in the chapter.
There's also a question, so we did talk a little bit about appraisal for qualitative studies. I guess could we elaborate on that a little bit more? So it's from anonymous questionnaire, but they've asked, really, are there any tips on appraising qualitative papers? I feel it's very difficult to appraise qualitative studies. And they mention that questions in the checklist are relatively ambiguous. I'm not sure who'd be best to answer that. Helen, Sheila? Go for Helen.
I can start us off, certainly. Yeah. And I agree. I mean, qualitative research, it's harder to appraise. There's less agreement on what makes a good study. And that's why with quite a lot of qualitative papers, they include all of the papers. They don't have a cutoff. They include all of them in order to be more inclusive and not to have an arbitrary cutoff. And the argument behind that is that weaker papers won't detract from the argument. They'll just be neutral, and the stronger papers will add to the argument. Now, whether or the extent to which that stands is something that that we could debate. But I think the reason that we've gone into that position of including everything rather than having a cutoff is because of the difficulty of making really sort of clear-cut assessment of qualitative research. Sheila, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, I think it goes back to the methods. papers should be judged against the methods that they have used. And increasingly, there are now publications indicating how you evaluate qualitative methods. So there's some very good, well-known publications, but they will vary. So if you're doing something like grounded theory, and there are different sorts of grounded theory, and within that, you need to look at how rigor is demonstrated against a set of criteria. Lucy Yardley, for example, has written very well on this. So notions of reliability and validity, which come from a quantitative tradition, may be about replicability and transferability would be the kinds of terms that we'd use. And how convincing is it? Is there sufficient sample size? It depends on the methods that you use. So you need to look carefully at the methods that you include, and then you need to read the paper, obviously, but you need to also be aware of how to judge that particular type of qualitative method.
Someone's also talked about, which I think is really, it's a good point. So it's May Chen has asked a question about how do you treat secondary sources in a literature review? For example, would you select systematic reviews in your review if it meets the inclusion criteria? And what about case studies? Helen, do you want to go kick that one off?
Yeah, I mean, it does depend. For student projects, and I would include PhDs in this, including lit reviews, it just makes it too complicated. For me, it makes it too complicated. It muddies the waters. You know, how do you deal with them? If you're going to include them, but you're also including individual papers. For me, it just gets too complicated. So my advice with those is you go to the reference list, you take out the papers that you might have missed in your search if they're relevant to your inclusion criteria, and you would include those that way round. It does depend on the question though, because sometimes secondary data might be relevant to the review. So as in the example that Nancy gave earlier on, so sometimes it might, but I think you've got to be really clear in your inclusion criteria. If you aren't, for me, the default is primary research papers. And if you're going wider than that, think really carefully about what the inclusion criteria are and what is the justification. So, you know, there will be cases when you do, but have really think really it should ring sort of a trigger. Oh, am I really sure about the inclusion criteria for this? It's probably the safest way to go.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with Helen that you don't want to muddy the waters by mixing them, but just to be aware there are reviews of reviews. So, or an umbrella review, there's different terminology for it. So there's an awful lot of research evidence and lots of reviews out there. You can do a review of reviews, but to do a mixture of a review with primary research is really difficult. And I'm like Helen, I'd say go back to the primary research papers.
That's good advice, I think. And then another question, I think from the same person, is how do you situate a literature review in relation to research paradigm? So this is probably something that's really relevant to PhD students, in that they have to know their research paradigm, where they're coming from. Sheila, do you want to start on that?
Oh, you've given me a difficult question here.
I know, it's a tricky one.
Right. Now, for some people, they come from a very specific perspective, and their whole thesis or dissertation comes from a particular framework. It could be positivism, it could be from social constructionism, whatever is appropriate. And then it's congruent, so everything is congruent. So your literature review comes from that perspective, the methods you have. Now, a lot of people don't know when they first start a lot about what paradigms are. And that's why for most PhD researchers anyway at that level, we suggest that students do a philosophy of science course. And in those courses, you start to unpack the nature of reality, ontology, epistemology, and what constitutes theory, what constitutes a paradigm. And while it might sound really tedious, when what you really want to do is get on with this fascinating topic that you've set your heart on studying for the next 3 years, it's actually really important to start by trying to understand the nature of reality and the nature of truth, which is what these topics are. Because otherwise, trying to make sense of that right at the very end of your PhD is quite problematic. So Nancy might have some good examples here.
What I was just going to say, that there's something, some people had asked about reporting guidelines, and the qualitative reporting guidelines is something called the integrative guidelines, and they have a really nice table in there which gives you examples of different research paradigms you might be in and the types of reviews that might match it. So if you're a critical realist, you might be going for thematic analysis or something like thematic synthesis. So I'll put that in the chat, and then people can refer to it because that might be helpful. That's after you've done everything that Sheila's said. It won't make sense otherwise.
I know, I always found that the philosophy research is a bit, it's like you either love it or you hate it. I didn't mind it, but I know I've got student colleagues here who just didn't really get on with it. Is an interesting question from Nicholas. When discussing the publishing of student research work, there seems to be a movement towards researchers now publishing the protocol before undertaking the search. While seeking to improve rigor, how do you feel about this, and how does it impact postgraduate study? Helen, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, yes, a good question. It's probably beyond the remit of MSc students to publish a protocol. Possibly beyond the remit of PhD students to do the same. I don't know, but the trend is moving in that direction though, isn't it, Nancy? What do you think?
I mean, somewhere like Prospero, which is a kind of just, it's a repository really to, I mean, it's not so much publishing, but it's, you can put your protocol up there. So that's a lot less painful. And it will come down to editors and whether they're going to insist you've published it in advance. And that is definitely the movement. Publishing an actual journal is really quite hard because most of the journals that will take it are open access journals, which you have to pay for. So it almost excludes most students immediately because of that. But somewhere like Prospero is a place you could put your PhD, and it's also definitely somewhere to look at before you start your review, to make sure nobody else is doing the review you're doing already. And I mean, that's just literally happened to one of my PhD students who was going to update a review, and he's just gone on Prospero, and the people who had done the original review have suddenly decided to update it, and there it is as a protocol. So he's changing topic.
Well, I remember, I think I did publish mine on the protocol on Prospero, and I guess there's a couple of things from my experience about that. One is that actually someone else searching for this topic found the review and got in contact with me, and that then made, I established contact with someone else doing research in this area because I published this sort of protocol, which is really useful. But the other thing is, because, which I think maybe this question is getting at a little bit, is that doing a PhD is a training process, isn't it? So you are going to make mistakes, and maybe you will want to go back. And so if you've published a protocol, does that sort of make it more tricky to maybe start your review again or adjust your research questions or something like that? I don't know if maybe you did say you shouldn't be doing that at all.
I'd say be a very very diligent examiner who checked your Prospero protocol. But the other thing is, like, so I was originally trained as a Cochrane reviewer. And one of the things you do when you write up your review is you say what's the differences between the protocol and the final methods you use, and that reflects the very iterative nature of doing a review, which methods will change depending on what you find. So it's, like we've said all along, this might be what I'm really hoping to do, but when you really get into the nitty-gritty of extracting from your papers, things do change, and it's okay to recognize that. And that doesn't mean you've done it wrong. It just shows that your PhDs are a learning journey. They're about demonstrating your learning, and learning what you've done wrong is as good as learning what you've done right.
Good advice. So I just want to make sure, may have missed some questions, so I apologise if that's the case. I think we've just got time for maybe one more. There was one at the end talking about, so going back to critical appraisal, I guess the applicability of critical appraisal tools in integrative reviews, as that review includes comprehensive documents and diversity of methods already covered, I think. I don't know if, is that anything, Sheila, would you like to speak to that a little bit, the applicability of appraisal tools to integrative reviews?
Yes, Nancy's the expert on integrative reviews, but I mean, I think they are a useful tool because what they help you do is get beyond potential bias, and that's what you're really looking for. So, and the potential of bias is including a lot of poorer quality papers. So it gives you an assessment. It doesn't tell you you should use it or you shouldn't use it, and most of them don't have clear cut-offs. You often have to set that yourself, although you can look at what other people have used and use that as a criterion. So yeah, I'm going to hand over probably at this point to Nancy, who might be able to help us a bit more.
I mean, I'd say the tool that Sheila developed, and I think someone's mentioned one in the chat, but a tool that can encompass both qualitative and quantitative is really helpful, because if you use two different tools, say the CASP tools, you've got one for your quantitative, one for your qualitative. How do you kind of make sense of that? And you know, it's when it comes down to synthesis, how do you merge all this together? And that can be quite problematic. So a tool that can cover both aspects, whether it's quant, qual or mixed methods, makes your life a lot easier. I mean, the other thing I would say is all these tools have massive limitations. You know, how well the abstract written, really, how much does that really impact how good the study was? You know, so I think, you know, you've got, and that's partly why the Cochrane collaboration moved away for them. So, you know, but I would say the big key issue with them, there's a massive expectation for them, and most publishers won't take a review without them. So find one that works for you and find one that works across all your papers.
And just a final question, I think someone's asked me, flagged that they'd really like their question answered. It's a bit of a long one, and I think it's a little bit specific. So Rob, it might be a question that specifically you'd want to go to, I don't know, supervisors or something. But I think really it's about, when you're, so his review that he's looking at is relates to every study he's found so far relates to a different clinical condition, for example, anxiety, depression. I think he's looking at cognitive behavioural therapy. And so I think he's struggling, should he break down his searches when he's looking for something like this into component parts? Is it okay to be doing different searches for different, I guess, conditions? When you're looking at intervention, that can be applied into lots of different areas and lots of different research areas. So I don't know if generally, could you just sort of in the final moment sort of talk a little bit about any thoughts you had on that? Who would like to take that one? Sheila?
I mean, you can have more than one research question. So I can't answer this specific person because I don't know the details of what they're trying to do. But we've talked about one review question. And that may be okay for the majority of people, particularly if you're doing a master's and you don't have much time. But if you're going to do a PhD and the review is a very substantial part of what you're going to do, you're going to spend your first year mostly working on it, for example, then it would be, in my view, appropriate to have more than one question. So that then may mean that you would have 2 or even 3 questions. And we did a study where we were just funded to do a literature review, and I think we had 3 questions, and we did slightly different searches in relation to each of those questions. So what we're doing is hopefully giving you some broad brush advice, but please seek specific advice from your supervisors in relation to your actual PhD.
Thank you, Sheila. All right, that's great. So I'll pass it back to Bryony because we're right up against the hour. So thank you, everyone, for your questions, and thanks for panelists as well.
Thank you so much, Maddie, for chairing for us, and thank you everyone for attending today. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to our panelists today, to Nancy, Sheila and Helen, for offering your advice. I'm sure people will have lots more questions. There's obviously been a huge amount of interaction today and lots of questions in the Q&A. So if you would like to know more, you have a new edition of Helen, Nancy and Sheila's book coming shortly. Let me just see if I can briefly share the details with you before we go. A moment, there we go. So you can see the details there. It is publishing next month, and it is available for pre-order via Amazon right now. So if you'd like to get a copy, if you're really keen and you'd like a bit more advice on how to go about doing your own literature review, then please do look that up. I've also put my contact details on there, so if you have any questions following the event, do feel free to email me or to link with us on social media. We will be sending out a recording of this event in the next couple of days, and I'll include a couple of links on there as well for your reference. So thank you once again to our panel. Thank you for everyone for attending today. Thank you for my colleagues behind the scenes who've been helping with the event today, and Beth on the chat box, Nafsana, who's done all the technical things behind the scene for us. I hope you found it useful, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much, and goodbye.